Alright, hi everyone, my name is Bethany. Welcome to my tutorial on case binding for books. In this video, I'm going to go over the process of making a blank case bound book that I just made with typing paper to illustrate the process of this binding technique. So I'm going to walk you through the three-step process to making a case bound book, which includes making the book block, making the casing, and then assembling the two pieces together for the final product. This video is definitely meant for people who are at home, maybe with access to limited materials, or people who are just getting into case binding and might not have everything that a professional bookbinder would use. That's fine. The technique that I learned how to do case binding from required things like a sewing frame and a book press, which are both things that I do not own or currently have access to, as we're all stuck in our houses. So I ended up DIYing that equipment from things that I had around my apartment, and I filmed that whole process in hopes that you can also do the same with things that you may have around your house. So before we get into what materials you'll need and start on step one of this, I just want to answer the question, if any of you are asking it, that is, what is case binding? How is it different than other binding techniques like stab stitching or pamphlet stitching, saddle stitch, whatever other binding techniques you might already be introduced to. So this is the book that I ended up making for this tutorial. It is a very small case bound book. It's only like roughly 4 by 5 inches. I wanted to make a small book, something that was very manageable, just for the sake of making a video on it. So this is what I ended up making. So a case bound book is, like I said before, it's two parts. It's the book block on the inside, so this area here, and then it is inside of this hard casing. Alright, so case bound books are really the most common like hardbound books. I'm sure this looks very familiar. It differs from stab stitch books in that all of the sewing that happened to bind this together, it's all happening internally. It's not external like in a stab stitch book like this one that I have here. You can see all of the sewing is happening right on the outside for everyone to see, whereas case bound book, it's all happening internally and it's hidden away. So because that the kind of inner workings of how the book is being held together is hidden, you end up with like a really nice, polished, professional looking book. Now, if you're planning on making a case bound book for the first time and you're wanting to use it for the purposes of like making a photo book, and you go ahead and you print your book block off from an InDesign file with all of your photos in it and whatnot, I would definitely suggest that you make a maquette first so that you can practice this binding technique. When looking at a case bound book, there are different terms for the different parts of it. So the top part of your book block is called the head, and the bottom part is called the foot. The part that sticks out from the side there is called the foredge. Knowing some of these terms is important as we go through making the book. So if I am saying that at a certain point you want to trim down the foredge because there are pages that are overhanging, that is what I'm talking about this portion of the book. This is definitely something that I would consider maybe to be like an intermediate level of bookbinding, and it takes a little bit of practice to get it right. So I would definitely suggest making a maquette before you go ahead and start using a book block that you've maybe gone ahead and printed photos on or something of that nature. So I just used plain printer paper for this book, which worked just fine. So that's maybe something that you could use for a maquette or any other disposable type of paper, like newspaper, something along those lines. You can see in the photo inserted here all of the supplies that you'll need to make this case bound book, but they're also listed by name in the description box down below. Alright, the first step is going to be preparing our book block, and we are going to start by measuring and cutting our paper. For this book, I'm just using plain white printer paper. Before I start any book block, I always go ahead and make sure that I have a brand new blade in my utility knife. This is going to be really important in making sure that all of your cuts to your book block are completely clean and not jagged. Start off by collecting your paper and tapping it on each side, as you can see here how I'm doing. This is going to just make sure that all of your paper is nice and even and that there isn't any pages sticking out in an odd way and that everything is stacked correctly before you go ahead and start measuring. For my book, I decided to go ahead and make the book block 4 by 5 inches. So I'm just measuring that out here. And you are going to measure this by doubling the number of the width of your paper. So here I measured 5 by 8 as we're folding those pieces of paper, those folios, in half. So just to clarify, as you're folding these pages in half, you're going to want to double the width of the paper. So if you're opening your book and it's normally going to be 4 by 5 inches, 4 being the width, you'd want to double that while you are cutting your paper for your signatures. As you're cutting your book block, you really want to just make it every single stroke only cutting the top sheet of paper that you're on. Don't try and cut through large sections of paper at a time, as this is going to really mess up the neatness of your book block overall, and it will likely cause you to rip through some pages. And it also kind of takes away from the fact that while you're cutting, you need to be keeping your blade completely vertical, upright to the rulers, to ensure that you're getting straight cuts. So just take your time as you're cutting through the book block, only going through one piece of paper at a time and moving it to the side. After you've cut your book block and you've got your pages to the correct dimensions for your book, you're going to want to start sectioning them off to make your signatures. For this book, I did 5 sheets of paper per signature. So that would be 5 folios if we're using bookmaking terms. So each individual sheet that goes into your signature is called a folio. You want to stack your sections of 5, or however many you're going to use for each signature, and fold it in half by connecting the bottom corners, the bottom right-hand corners. Just start from the very bottom on the seam and work your way up with the bone folder to smooth it out and really crease that edge. For this book, I'm doing a total of 6 signatures for my book block, so that's 6 signatures with 5 pieces of paper in each one. The next step is going to be preparing our signatures to be sewn. Start by stacking your signatures similarly to how you tapped the paper earlier to make sure that everything is even. Place a heavy object on top of the signatures to hold them down while you measure out where you're going to be putting your holes. Before we get into marking off where all of our holes are going to be to start sewing, number your signatures from 1 to however many are in your book. Start from the bottom of the stack. Just do a small number up in the top left-hand corner. This won't be seen at the end, but it will help you keep track of the order your signatures were cut in and folded to make things easier while you're making the book block. Now we're going to start measuring out the holes for where we're going to be sewing our signatures together. So start 1/2 inch in from either end. We're going to end up using 3 pieces of binding tape, so you're going to want a hole on either side of those. If you start 1/2 inch in from either end to mark where you're going to put your first piece of binding tape, the rest can just be evenly spaced out from there. This is going to vary depending on how big your book block is. It's not going to look exactly the same as the one that I'm making if your book is larger or even smaller than this one. Next, you're going to want to grab your binder's tape. We're going to use the binder's tape to hold up against the book block to measure out how wide those gaps need to be. I'm just marking the top signature as I am measuring things out, and then from there I will go, and once I have everything placed where I want it to be, I will continue that mark on all of those signatures on their spines. To continue that mark, I'm just going to grab something that's a right angle. If you have a right angle ruler, that would work best, but I am just using this piece of cardboard that is right angle to help make sure that all of those lines where I'm marking on my signatures are even and flush. You're going to continue this, marking all of the signatures where you previously spaced out those dots. After you've gone ahead and marked all of your signatures, you can then take the stack apart again. As they're numbered, you're going to know which order to put them back in. Open up the signatures in half and place a paper clip on either edge to help hold the pages together to keep them from coming apart. We're going to go ahead and stab the holes into the spines of each ones that we just marked. So by putting those clothespins there, that's going to keep the papers from shifting while you're making those holes. If they shift while you're doing this, it'll create an uneven book block. Taking 2 books that are the same height, fully extend the signature over top of it so that you have the spine resting right on the gap in between those 2 books. These are going to act as like a stand for the signatures while we take our awl, which is the tool that I just showed, to gently, very gently perforate those holes that we marked. You don't have to go super deep with the awl, just deep enough to go through the stack of the folios in the signature. Continue this down the spine of the signature until you have made a hole at each marked spot. You're going to do this for all of the signatures in your stack for your book block. After you've made the holes in all of the signatures of your book block, we're going to move on to making a sewing frame. So you can make a sewing frame out of a semi-sturdy material like cardboard, which is what I'm doing here. I'm just using the lid of a shoebox that I had. This sewing frame is going to be a tool that helps us hold the binder's tape and kind of the book block in place as we're sewing all of our signatures together. So all you have to do is make a rectangle and then cut a window out of that rectangle. The window has to be at least the length and height of the book block itself. So as my books were 5 inches long, the window had to at least be 5 inches. I didn't get too precise with measuring this, you don't have to be very precise with measuring it as long as it is at least the length of the book block. After you've finished cutting the window out of the sewing frame, you're going to attach it onto a table or whatever surface you're working on to make your book. I just do this with clear packing tape to hold it onto the side of the table, as you can see here. After you've taped that sewing frame to the table, move your book block of the stack of your signatures in order back up against it, up to the edge of the table. Then stack some heavy books on top of it to hold them in place. I'm going ahead now that those are all in place and I've got my binder's tape. The length of your binder's tape and the amount that you need, the amount of strands that you'll need, is really going to be determined by how big and thick your book is. For my book, I'm only using 3 strands, and the binder's tape is just long enough to wrap around either side of the book, but it doesn't extend past the pages. After you've cut the binding tape, you're going to position it in between the holes that you've marked out. I attached my binder's tape to the sewing frame by using clear thumbtacks. Attach it to the sewing frame so that it rests. Each piece rests in between the holes that you marked out with the awl. You're going to be sewing in and around these pieces of binder's tape. The reason that they're attached to the sewing frame is so that your hands are free to do all of the sewing. At this point, you're going to thread your binding needle with your white thread. I'm using pre-waxed bookbinding thread. If you don't have pre-waxed thread, you can wax it with beeswax. The wax just acts as a barrier to keep it from getting tangled while you're sewing. It's not completely necessary, but it is very helpful. You're going to start by going in through the first hole at the bottom of your signature and pulling it through the hole and tying a knot. After you've pulled it through the first hole, you're going to come back out of the second hole. At this point, you're going to go over that first piece of binder's tape closest to the bottom of the signature and go back in through the third hole. You'll continue this pattern until you get to the top of the signature. Make sure that you're pulling your thread taut as you're going and not leaving loose gaps. As you pull your binder's needle through the last hole on your first signature, the hole up at the top, you're going to get ready to stack your second signature on top. While you're pulling your thread through your signatures though, be sure that you're keeping your thread taut in the correct way. Pull your thread lengthwise with the spine, as you can see and I'm doing here, instead of pulling it towards yourself. If you pull the thread towards yourself like that, it's going to cause the paper to rip easier, so best to pull the thread long ways for kind of the structural integrity of those holes in your signatures. Grab the second signature at this point and stack it on top of the first one. Since you pulled your thread out through that first signature in the top hole, you're simply going to feed it in through the top hole on the second signature. Pull the thread taut through that hole and then wrap it over your binding tape, just in the same method that you had done on the first signature until you get down to the end of the two signatures. At this point, you're going to throw a stitch in, which is called a kettle stitch. This is going to keep those two signatures together down at the end. Cross your ends together and then run the needle up through the middle of them. This is going to pull this stitch into a loop, as you can see there. I'll also link in the description box a more detailed video from another YouTuber on a kettle stitch who will go into it a little bit deeper if you need that resource. Continue this pattern of sewing through your signatures until you get through all of them or until you run out of thread. You're going to need to be cognizant of how much thread you have left. When you start to run out, you're going to want to tie a new piece on, and you're going to want to do this over a piece of binding tape. Start by taking the needle off of the original piece of thread that you were running through your signatures so that you can create this loop. You're going to take your new piece of thread and pull it through one side of the loop, and then back over it and up through the other side again. You're going to end up having this loop that pulls into a knot close to the edge of the signature, as you can see here. This will take a little bit of practice. I would suggest trying this on two pieces of thread before you try it on the signature, just to get it under your belt. It is a little tricky. I still have difficulty sometimes getting it nice and tight up to the edge. Go ahead and trim off the excess thread on the ends after you've gone ahead and completed that. When you reach the end of the last hole on the last signature, you're going to put another kettle stitch in to tie that last end down with the rest of the book block. I also go in and I do another loop, and I will even tie the two ends just for good measure, just to make sure that it is all staying together. After you've tied the ends off, just trim off the excess. And there you have your almost completed book block. The sewing portion of this is now all completed. You can see that there are these gaps in between the signatures after you've sewn them together where that binding tape is visible. You're going to go ahead and take a piece of wax paper and just leave a very small, about 1/4 of an inch gap on one side of the signature in between the two of them, and you're going to apply a thin layer of glue. Laying that wax paper down is going to protect the glue from spreading out onto the rest of the page and make that line nice and even. After you've put that line of glue down, just gently push the two signatures together. So you'll start on the front end between two signatures, laying that glue down, and then you'll just continue this for all 6 signatures so that they're nice and seamless at the spine and that you don't see those gaps. After allowing that glue to dry in between the signatures for about 30 minutes with a heavy book on top, we're going to move on to the next section, which is applying the mull. So taking 2 books, just any heavy books, I use these sketchbooks, sandwiched in between some wax paper, I am going to make a makeshift book press. Sandwiching the book block in between these 2 sketchbooks and some wax paper to keep glue from getting on the pages, I am going to put a clamp onto this. This is now my makeshift book press. At this point, you're going to want to go ahead and grab your mull, which is this linen fabric. We're going to apply a piece of this on the spine. The mull shouldn't extend any longer than the kettle stitch on either end of your book block, but it should at least be able to cover those. It should also be about 3 inches wide going down either side of the front and back cover of the book. You're going to go ahead and apply glue with your brush all along the spine, on top of the thread, on top of the binder's tape, and just apply a very generous amount. After you've applied that generous amount, go back in with your finger and really work the glue onto that binder's tape. You want to make sure that it's thoroughly saturated. From there, you'll go ahead and place your mull on top. After you've applied the mull, you're going to go back in again and apply another very generous layer of glue on top of the mull. Moving on to one of the last steps of our book block is going to be cutting our end papers. Your end papers are going to be the same dimensions as the signatures that you cut for your book block. So in my case, because each folio in my book block was 5 by 8, I went ahead and cut 2 pieces of end paper that were also 5 by 8. For your end papers, you can choose any kind of decorative paper that you'd like. This is just some paper that I had in my bookmaking supplies that I wanted to use, as it went with Bookcloth that I had chosen. After you've cut your end papers, you're going to go ahead and fold them just like how you would with your signatures. Make sure you put the decorative design part on the inside of the fold, as that's what we're going to be seeing when you open the book up. Now that my end papers have been cut and folded, I'm going to attach them onto my book block. You're going to do a similar method to how we kind of closed up those gaps in between the signatures of the book block. You're going to take your piece of wax paper, you're going to leave a very small margin on the top of your first signature. And right where that small margin is, you're going to apply a layer of glue. After you've applied that layer of glue, you're going to select your end paper and put it down on top of the book block. You're going to line it up with all of your other signatures, make sure that it's in place properly, there's no edges hanging over, and then using your bone folder, just gently smooth that seam down. You can see that the two pieces are now attached. You're just going to flip your book block over and do this to the other side with the other end paper. Now that your end papers are in place, we're going to address the foredge of the book. The foredge of the book has some of the signatures a little bit out of alignment, and some seem to be hanging out a little bit. That is just due to how they were folded. Some of the paper tends to stick out a little bit at the center once you fold your signatures. This is a really easy fix. I just went in with my ruler and my utility knife and I cut off a very, very small fraction of an inch. Nothing that's going to affect the overall size of the book, but it's still going to give me a nice clean edge. And I'm following that same idea, mentality of cutting a book block, of just really going through one piece of paper at a time to get a smooth cut and to get it as even as possible. At this point, you could also go ahead to the head and the foot of the book as well if they are a little uneven, and just shave off a really small fraction of that without cutting into that mull or binder's tape where you're sewing or anything. You can also take a piece of sandpaper and really, really gently hit the edge of your book if you want to smooth some of that out. To start on the case for our book, we're going to measure out our front and back covers. Start by taking two pieces of scrapbook board and holding it on top of the book block along the spine. We're going to measure outward from that edge of those scrap pieces to the outer edge of the book. The rule of thumb for your book covers is that each edge from the top, bottom, and the foredge should hang over about 1/8 of an inch. You can kind of hack this in your measurements by just adding 1/4 inch to the overall height of your book and then adding 1/8 of an inch outward. This is just a diagram that I drew to figure out my book block, which was 4 by 5 inches, what those measurements would mean for my front and back cover. One of the trickiest parts about doing bookmaking, I often feel like, at least for me, is the measurements, and I do feel like it's something that you kind of have to get a hang of doing more and more bookmaking. But if any of you have any questions that are more specific to what you're working on, or just wanting me to clarify any more about that measurements for getting your front and back cover, just leave them in the comments and I will be happy to try and help you by responding. Here I am just checking how that book board is hanging over 1/8 of an inch on the top, the bottom, and that foredge. So I'm making sure basically that I did my measurements correctly, which I did. To get the measurement for the spine of your book, you're going to pick up the book block and sandwich it between the front and back cover that you just cut out. Applying light pressure, then take your ruler and measure from the top of that top cover to the bottom of the bottom cover of the book board. That thickness is going to be how thick your spine should be. Before you start assembling all these pieces on the book cloth, I just hit each edge with the sandpaper a little bit to kind of smooth them out. We're going to move on to our book cloth and gluing down the front, back cover, and spine. So I start by unrolling my book cloth out, and I lay my ruler horizontally on the bottom edge, and I draw a straight line. This is just going to help make sure that everything is kind of in alignment with each other, and one isn't higher than the other, so everything is nice and straight. I leave I'd say about an inch of space, an inch margin on either side of the front and back cover when you lay them out like this. Start marking off where you have that piece of bookboard on the right, that back cover. Make a little mark at the base of each corner. To measure out the space for our French grooves in between the covers and the spine, grab 3 pieces of scrap bookboard and just stack them together like this. You're going to go ahead and place it along the left edge of that piece of bookboard that I just marked out. Once you've done that, throw with your pen just a little mark where that stack of bookboard ends. This is where you're going to know to put your spine. Do the same for the other side of the spine so that you also have an even French groove on the other side. After you've marked out each of the sections that your front and back cover and spine are going to lay out on, you're going to go ahead and apply the glue. I apply the glue directly onto the bookboard. I feel that if you put it onto the book cloth first and it sits there, it can cause some wrinkling to happen. So I prefer to do it on the bookboard and then apply that onto the book cloth. Once I've laid it down and got it into position, I just go ahead and smooth it out. I smoothen these kind of outward diagonal motions to also help try and prevent wrinkling of the book cloth from the happening on the surface beneath it. And you're just going to go ahead and do the same step for the spine and the other cover. Make sure that you spread the glue out very evenly after you've applied it to all of the bookboards. Again, leaving the glue to kind of be bunched up or really collect in a thick line in some places will cause wrinkling in your book cloth. So make sure that you take the time to adequately smooth that out before you place down your board. After you've gone and put down each piece of bookboard, you're going to go on a diagonal with your ruler and measure 1/4 inch out from each corner. After you've measured out from each corner, you're going to draw a diagonal line like I'm showing you here. This is just showing you where you want to cut your corners. If you leave your corners long the way they are right now on the book cloth, when we go to fold it over, it's going to bunch up and the corners of the book cloth are not going to fold neatly. So we're just going ahead and cutting off that excess. Now that you've cut off all of your corners, we're going to start approaching the folding portion of the book cloth. You can go ahead with your bone folder and pre-score all of your edges with the book cloth. I usually do that. I didn't do that in this tutorial. I went right in for the glue here, but you can do either or. I would suggest going in and pre-scoring. So I just put one long line of glue right up against that bottom edge of the bookboard, and then I also went on top and I put one line of glue. The one on the actual bookboard surface I've gone and smoothed out so that it's not kind of gloppy in some places. And now I'm taking my bone folder and I am scoring those edges and pushing it in really tight. You're going to do the same for the top and just grab either side of the book cloth and pull it in very taut and smooth it down. At this point, you're going to get to your corners. I've just used my fingernail to really crease them down on either side so that they are ready to fold our ends in. To fold in the ends, you're going to do the same thing. Apply a line of glue up against the edge of your bookboard and on top of the surface of the bookboard, all the while being very careful not to get too much excess glue on your bone folder, on your bookboard, or on your hands. You just don't want to transfer that extra glue onto the surface of the book cloth because it will be very hard, if not impossible, to get out. Using your bone folder, just go in and smooth down all those edges. If there's an area where you feel like you need a little bit more glue, you can really gently put some on a piece of paper and slide it underneath that loose book cloth edge and smooth it down with your bone folder. After wiping off the excess glue on the bookboard, I'm now going into the next step, which is creating my French grooves. For this method of creating your French grooves, you're going to go and fill in those gaps on either side of your spine with glue. Be sure that you really get some underneath the book cloth on either top and bottom edge. Be very generous with the glue, making sure that you're really coating either side of the bookboard edges. I'm now going to take a piece of wax paper that I cut to the right size, and I'm going to lay it on top of the surface of the bookboard. Laying the bookboard flat, we're going to create our French grooves by using the bone folder. Check your bone folder, make sure that it doesn't have any glue on it, as this is going to be visible from the outside and you don't want glue on the surface of your book. Finding those edges on either side, or the indentations on either side of the spine, I'm really gently going to start moving the bone folder back and forth to create the indentation of the French groove. While you're doing this, be very gentle with it. The book cloth can be torn by pushing too hard or by pushing with the pointed tip of the bone folder. So I like to use the long straight edge and do this kind of slowly, just going back and forth over it multiple times for different passes. Ideally, you'd let this sit and dry overnight. And then in the morning, you would take the wax paper off and allow any glue that maybe hasn't fully dried yet to get some air on it. After this has dried overnight, we are now going to go in to the final step, which is assembling the two pieces. We are going to add our book block into the case binding. At this step, I'm going in and I'm just trimming off the excess binder's tape that is sticking out past the mull. We don't need it at this point, so I'm just trimming that off. So your book block should look something like this at this point. To glue the book block into the case binding, you're going to start on the inside front cover and you're going to make about an inch margin of glue. That inch margin of glue is going to grab onto the mull and the binder's tape that we had put down, or that we have sewn and glued onto our book block. Take a piece of wax paper and slide it underneath that binder's tape so that you're protecting the end paper while you're gluing this together. After you have pushed the mull and the binder's tape down onto the book board for that kind of inch margin of glue, securing it there, go ahead and add on some more glue onto the whole cover, being careful not to go past the kind of 1/8 inch edge where your book, where your end paper is not going to be covering. Go ahead and make sure that you've really smoothly pushed out all of your glue or brushed it out so that you don't get any bubbles in your end paper. And again, throw another piece of wax paper in between those two, because once you shut the book to kind of smooth it out, there's always a chance that some glue will escape and the pages will stick together. So for the time being, just put a piece of wax paper in between those two. You're going to go ahead and do this to the back of the book as well, first gluing down the mull and the binder's tape, and then applying a second layer of glue on top of those after that first layer had dried. And you are going to extend that out to all the edges of that back cover of the board, except for that 1/8 of an inch margin where the end papers aren't going to cover. And then you're going to rest a heavy book or object on top of this, ideally overnight, to really let it dry. All right, yeah, that was the whole tutorial on making a case-bound book. I really hope that you guys thought it was interesting or found it informative. If any of you are wanting to make a case-bound book but you have questions at a certain step or about the process or technique, please feel free to comment them and I will get back to you and try and help you out as best as I can. Or you can contact me directly and I can help you from there. So I think that is it. Good luck, guys, on your binding, and I hope everyone is doing well, and staying healthy right now. So good luck, guys.